Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics 111. We're now prepared to begin discussing monetary policy. And to do that, we're going to say that when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply by any one of the three tools of monetary policy, which we're going to see shortly, it's called easy money. And that's going to, if they increase the supply of money, it's going to lower interest rates, and it's going to stimulate GDP because of durable good orders and business orders. This is done to fight a recession. So let's look at a supply of money graph, which we discussed in a prior video. Here's the supply of money, the quantity of money, interest rates as a percentage, and the demand for money. Let's assume that this is our aggregate supply situation. Here's our aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand in a recession. Our goal is to get here. GDP full employment. This is GDP real. Don't forget to put the real there. And this is price level, the rate of inflation. Alright. The government would want to undertake an easy money policy meant to increase the money supply, causing interest rates to fall, causing durable good orders for consumers to go up, interest-sensitive purchases, long-lasting things, generally expensive, often paid for with borrowed money. More would be borrowed at a lower interest rate. IG would also change because IG is also interest rate sensitive, as interest rates are a cost of taking out a loan and undertaking new projects. So the purpose of easy money is to fight a recession. The goal is to increase the money supply, and they can do this with the three tools of monetary policy. They can buy securities, government bonds, on the open market. Open market operations. I like to do this with a pictogram: the Federal Reserve and the public. We need to increase the supply of money. So I draw money going this way. That means the bonds have to be coming this way. That means that the open market operation appropriate to expanding GDP, easy money policy, is for the Federal Reserve to buy bonds. Money held by the Federal Reserve does not count as money. It's not available to buy GDP. Money held by the public, when the Federal Reserve buys the bonds, they give the public a check. The check is deposited in a bank. Checks count as part of M1. Okay, so now the next tool is to lower the reserve ratio. The federal government would want to lower the reserve ratio. That would mean total reserves minus required reserves equals excess reserves. And lowering the reserve ratio would mean less money would have to be held in the bank and more money can be loaned out. In addition, the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio as a percentage. The lower the reserve ratio, the larger the money multiplier. The larger the increase in the money supply that would result. The third tool of monetary policy is the discount rate. The discount rate is the amount of money, the penalty banks have to pay to the Federal Reserve when they are short on their required reserves. So let's say total reserves are, let's say checkable deposits are 100, and let's say the reserve ratio as a percentage is 20%. The bank would have to keep $20 in required reserves as in dollars. Let's say the bank had 110 in total reserves. Maybe 10 of that is owner's equity and is not subject to required reserves. You subtract the $20, and the bank, that would be required reserves, and the bank could loan out excess reserves of 90. But suppose the bank was very aggressive and wanted to make even more profits, and instead loaned out 100. the bank would be short on its required reserves of 10. They loaned out 10 too much. This would fall to 10. This would rise to 100. There are two interest rates. There are two places the bank can get the money from. If the bank borrows the money from the Federal Reserve, they borrow this 10 they're short on their required reserves. They loaned out too much money. They're 10 short. They could borrow from the Federal Reserve, and the interest rate they pay is the discount rate. On the other hand, the bank could borrow it from other private banks. That interest rate, for the same purpose of shoring up their required reserves, is called the federal funds rate. The discount rate is lower than the federal funds rate. So you may ask the question, why wouldn't they always borrow from the Federal Reserve? That's because if they borrow from the Federal Reserve, the fact that the bank is borrowing because they are short on their required reserves is public, because you're borrowing it from the government. The government has to release that information. So if the bank doesn't want that information to become public, they can borrow it from another private bank and pay the slightly higher federal funds rate and keep their information confidential. But don't confuse these. The discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges, and the federal funds rate is the rate they pay to private banks when they're short on the required reserve ratio, which is set by the Federal Reserve. So easy money is meant to fight a recession, and these are the three tools. Tight money is meant to restrict the supply of money and fight inflation. Here, what we would have is aggregate demand inflationary, GDP sub I, and this is price level sub I. And you'd want to decrease aggregate demand from AD1 to AD full employment. You would want to do that by reducing the money supply. You would want to push this would be reversed. Instead of increasing originally, instead of decreasing the interest rate, you would now be increasing the interest rate. You would go from this equilibrium to this equilibrium when the money supply shifted this way. That decrease in the money supply would cause interest rates to rise, which would cause C and IG to fall, pushing aggregate demand back towards full employment. The open market operation, do a pictogram, you want the money to be coming this way, away from the public where it's counted as M1, to the Federal Reserve where it's not counted as money. So bonds would have to be flowing the other way. So the Federal Reserve selling bonds is contractionary, meant to fight inflation. These are expansionary, meant to fight recession. Or the Federal Reserve could increase the reserve ratio. By increasing the reserve ratio, more deposits have to be kept in the bank and less can be loaned out as excess reserves. In addition, since the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio as a percentage, increasing the reserve ratio will lower the money multiplier, resulting in a smaller change. Finally, there's a discount rate. And by increasing the discount rate, the penalty for getting caught short on your required reserves is greater, so banks are less likely to overextend themselves. Those are the three tools of monetary policy, which we'll now use a quantitative example